Hello, welcome back to Ling 201, Lecture 2, Introduction to Linguistics. I'm your instructor, Brett C. Nelson. This is Week 9's lecture and our first week of syntax. Today we'll be talking about categories and constituents. So the readings for today were from Contemporary Linguistic Analysis, Chapter 5, the first two sections, sections 0 through 1 on syntax. Announcements for this week. On Thursday, your fourth discussion post is due. However, because the upcoming week is reading week, it can be delayed if you want to focus more on what's due the next day, the assignment. So assignment 1 will be due via D2L on Friday by the end of the day, 11:59 p.m. Before we start, we'll have a land acknowledgement. So we're here learning in the area where the Bow and Elbow rivers meet in southern Alberta, a place known in Blackfoot as Mohkinstsis, which is a name now usurped for the city of Calgary. This land lies within the territory of Treaty 7, which was signed by this land's stewards, representatives of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda. Additionally, this land is home to speakers of Cree and Ktunaxa, as well as members of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I am a newcomer to this land. I come from Bobancha, the land of many tongues at the mouth of the Mississippi, which is the Great River. That's the word for it in Ojibwe. I strive to learn more about this land, its peoples, their languages, and their histories every day. At the University of Calgary, I hope to contribute to and continue a journey of transformation and renewal in our ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being, all with the spirit of truth and reconciliation for continued shared enjoyment of this beautiful place. So the plan for today I'll be introducing the core concepts of the analysis of phrases and sentences, which we will come to know as syntax. And we'll learn how to determine the syntactic categories of words and phrases. From there, we begin to diagram the basic phrases based on a set of phrase structure rules. And again, we will be developing tests for verifying that phrase structure, and that depends on the types of syntactic categories that they belong to. So as we start with every section of every module of this course, we have a brief discussion about what it means to know that part of the language. So part of knowing a language is knowing how to put the words we get from morphology together into larger phrases and sentences. We also know when an utterance doesn't follow these rules. So there's something that just an alarm bell that goes off. Something's not right here. And so that is something that we do know as when we know a language is we know when something doesn't sound right. So for example, we know that the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog is a perfectly valid sentence in most varieties of English. I'd say all varieties of English. However, jumps brown quick fox the dog lazy the over is hard to say because it doesn't follow or it doesn't seem to follow these rules. So alarm bells are going off. So this is a concept we'll know as grammaticality, whether or not an utterance is accepted as valid by the speakers of a language or a language variety. And what goes into that validity or that grammaticality is the syntax. So the syntax are the rules for putting words together into grammatical phrases and sentences. So in order to kind of describe the syntax and how words are coming together to form phrases, we'll have to develop a way to represent them. And so the classic tried and true method of structural representation, as we've seen throughout this course, is trees. And in fact, when most people think of linguistic trees, it's these syntactic trees that they think about. So here is a basic syntactic tree. They, hear, us. We'll label this more in details in a bit. But as you can see, even if you get a bit more complicated by adding another word, it doesn't complicate things too much. We just add another branch. So man and the moon and they, hear, us are pretty similar. You just add another division. And we'll get into why this is in a bit. So we'll learn that the structures like these are for any phrase or sentence are derived by two processes. move, where one element is carried to another part of the structure, and merge, where two or more elements are combined to form a larger phrase. So with these two operations, we'll be able to develop a tree structure for essentially any phrase or sentence in language. But before we do that, they don't just combine all willy-nilly. They do have certain rules that depend on the categories of the words and phrases that you're combining, or you're moving and merging. So we do have to develop a handful of categories in order to group these words or phrases into and how they behave in a sentence or phrase. So these are also known as parts of speech, or as we saw previously, lexical categories in morphology. So these are typically distinguished in languages based on their morphological structure, their meaning, and how they can interact syntactically with other words in forming larger phrases. So there are two types of categories. There are the lexical categories, which we saw last week, or last unit with morphology, and these have a definable or paraphrasable meaning. In other words, you can really set a pretty concrete meaning to what these things are referring to. Whereas the other type of category are the functional categories, and these perform syntactic roles but are otherwise hard to define or paraphrase like we can with the lexical categories. So to break these down, we'll go right into them with the lexical categories. So the lexical categories provide the phrases and indeed the sentences with the meaning. These are also known as the content words of a sentence. So for this chapter, there will be 5 lexical categories, and many of which we had previously discussed in morphology. So the first of these is nouns, which we saw, which refer to persons, places, things, or ideas. So in this sentence, there are several nouns. I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So there are 4 nouns there: I, market, bike, and bananas. Each of those refers to a person, a place, or a thing. And there's no ideas here. I mean, I guess anything can be an idea. But these are all the nouns in that sentence. The next lexical category we'll discuss, we also saw in morphology, are the verbs. And the verbs refer to actions or states. So in our test sentence, there are a couple verbs. So I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So go and buy are verbs which refer to a movement and an action, purchasing something, buying. A third of these, again, we saw in morphology, is the adjective category. So the adjectives are the descriptors or the modifiers of nouns. So I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So there are 2 adjectives here, little and blue. Little helps describe or narrow down market into something that's smaller than a normal size market, I guess. And blue narrows down from just a general bike that's of any color, with no specific color, to one that is specifically of the hue or blue, a specific range of perceived light. If we're defining our words within these lexical categories, we could have to define them, and we can. The fourth of these is something we didn't see, and this is adverbs. So adverbs are the descriptors of verbs and adjectives. So either they describe verbs directly or describe or modify adjectives and other adverbs. So there were 2 adverbs in this sentence. I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So quickly describes how I would go. In this case, with a fast pace, a quick pace is what it literally means, in a quick manner. And tomorrow is also an adverb that refers to when I will be doing the going, and that will be tomorrow, the day after today. And so we have manner adverbs and temporal adverbs. There's different types of adverbs as well. It's just just the plain descriptor adverb. And the fifth lexical category we'll talk in this chapter is something we talked about previously in morphology, are the prepositions. So prepositions are describe the relationships between nouns and other words or ideas in the sentence. So there are a couple prepositions in this sentence. I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So to describes where to the goal or the end state of my going, and on my blue bike says where the going is happening. In this case, it's happening while on my bike. So the going is on my bike. So we're relating things to different nouns. The to is relating the action to the market, and the on is relating the action to the bike. And that's what prepositions do. They relate things either to nouns or from nouns. So those are our lexical categories, but we also have a whole new set of terms for the syntax, and these are the functional categories, which words can be a part of as well. So functional categories are going to be our words that perform grammatical or connective roles in phrases without really adding any lexical content or meaning. In other words, they're non-lexical categories is how we can define them. So there are 4 functional categories we'll talk about in this chapter, and all of these are things we didn't discuss in morphology. Functional categories typically are a finite set of words within a language, and you'll see what I mean after I give these examples. So determiners are a functional category which specify how many or which nouns are being referred to. So in this sentence we had 2 determiners, the and my. So I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow. The little market. It's specifying a definite single, or it doesn't have to be single, but in this case it is single, but a definite little market rather than just any little market. It determines a specific market. And my does a similar thing for blue bike, in that it's specifying that it is my blue bike, not anyone else's. It's giving a particular referent in the universe. And so that's what the functional category of determiner is doing. It's picking out a specific subset, or indeed a single item from the set of all of the things that the words that it's modifying can refer to. The next functional category might be a bit weird because you might think of them as verbs, but in fact they aren't really adding any lexical content, so they're non-lexical category, a functional category of auxiliary verbs. So these are verbs, quote unquote, that must always accompany lexical verbs. They're just there to help out those lexical verbs with some grammatical or connective role that they otherwise don't or can't do. And so that's why they're auxiliaries. They're just helping out. Helping verb is another way to describe these. So in our sentence, we only have a single auxiliary verb, and it's the second word, would. I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So this would is an auxiliary verb. It's specifically called a modal because it describes a conditional. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I am going to go to the market. It's saying that there's a possibility that's contingent on something else, and that's what the grammatical or connective role that this auxiliary verb would is playing, in that it's modifying, it's providing a modification to the meaning of go that depends on something else. The next functional category we'll talk about are the conjunctions. So the conjunctions connect 2 or more words or phrases of the same category and allow them to kind of behave as one unit within a sentence. So there was one conjunction in our sentence. I would quickly go to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buy more bananas. So in this case, this conjunction is connecting going to the little market tomorrow on my blue bike and buying more bananas and joining them together to be carried out by I, the subject of the sentence. So I would quickly go to the little market on my blue bike is a valid sentence, and so is I would buy more bananas. And so what's what this and is doing is joining those two buy more bananas verb phrases, buy more bananas and go to the little market tomorrow together so that they can both take the subject I would. And the last functional category we'll talk about in this class are the degree words. So the degree words specify the quantity of a preposition or an adjective. So these is a type of modifier that isn't really lexical. It really serves as an intensifier or some other specification of quantity, similar to how a determiner specifies a specific referent in the universe. The degree word specifies how much of a preposition or an adjective, or indeed a noun. So in this sentence, we have one degree word, and it is more bananas rather than just bananas. It indicates that there exists some set of bananas, and we're just going to go buy more of that than that set. So I'd quickly go to the little market tomorrow on the blue bike and buy more bananas. So it specifies to the degree of how many bananas, and so that's going to fall into our category of degree words. So I briefly touched on how we can determine the category of a word based on these examples, but this one example sentence, however, words can be a bit blurrier than that. And so for now, we're going to develop tests to determine the category of a word. So we have 9 syntactic categories that we have to sort, basically any word that we're going to analyze within a phrase into each of those categories. So how can we do this? Well, there are 3 main methods. The first of these is we can ask about their meaning. So lexical categories have clear-cut meanings, but sometimes depend on the context for the specific categorization. So we have to ask the questions in order to derive a particular meaning. And if we could do this, we're getting closer to the actual category of that word. So if we take the word happy, we can ask, is it someone or something? Or is someone or something doing it? Or we could ask, is it a property of an object, or is it a property of an action? So each of these will, if the answer is yes to any of these, then we get close to a answer about what type of lexical category, or what type of syntactic category, and specifically what type of lexical category. So if you can think about this, if it is someone or something, you're asking basically, is it a noun? Is someone or something doing it? Then you're asking, is it a verb? If the answer is yes, it's a verb. Is it a property of an object? A happy dog? Yeah, it's a property of a dog. It can be. So we can answer that question yes to, is it a property of an object or a person or a thing? And if you can, then you are an adjective. And so that's how we can determine that happy is an adjective. Another way to determine the category of a word is to use morphology. And so previously in this course, we talked about how inflectional morphemes only take particular lexical categories, and that's basically what we're going to be using to test for whether or not a word is of a particular lexical category. So in English, we have those 8 inflectional affixes, and we could try applying, and they're quite productive, so we can try applying them to the word we're looking at and see if we get an answer. So if we're going to test happy, which even though we already found that it was an adjective, we can test it some more by looking at more its inflectional properties. So can happy take the plural noun suffix s, happies? Not usually. You'll have to get a really contrived case to get that. So I'll say no. Can it take that verbal s, happies? He happies. She happies. It happies. Probably not, so we'll say no for that. What about the adjectival est? So that's the superlative est, the most happy, or the happiest. Yes, happiest. Happiest is a word. So happy takes that adjectival inflection est. So that's more evidence that this is indeed an adjective. And the third test for determining the category of a word refers to its syntactic context. What other words are appearing with that word? So this is just we call this its distribution with other words, or its co-occurrence. So we know that I'll tell you that nouns typically appear with determiners, verbs typically appear with auxiliaries, and adjectives typically appear with degree words. So you could try, instead of inflecting it, modifying each of these, the word with each of these other functional categories, the determiners, auxiliaries, and degree words, and that will give you a clue as to what the lexical category of a word is. So if we want to try that again with happy, can we say the happy? Not on its own. It doesn't really have any real good, feel good meaning when we say the happy. So probably not a noun, which would, because that's a determiner. So we say they could happy? No. So could is another auxiliary that accompanies verbs, and it doesn't go well here. So happy is probably not a verb. Let's try our degree word to see if it's an adjective. So can we say they are very happy? Yes, very happy is an acceptable phrase. It's of a degree word and an adjective. So happy has passed the tests for adjectives in each of the meaning, inflection, and distributional types of, or methods of testing for categories. So we've determined that happy is an adjective. There are also other clues to how we can categorize words into their categories. So in sentences, we can even identify the categories of words that have no extant meaning. So this will help when we have those functional words. Or just how they're appearing in a sentence. So Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice in Wonderland, had a poem, or wrote a poem, that was mainly nonsense words. And the poem was called Jabberwocky. Some of you I know are familiar with this. Some of you might not be, but I'll give a couple lines from it here. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Well, come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, Callooh Callay, he chortled in his joy. So there are lots of words in here that don't have a meaning, they didn't have a meaning before Lewis Carroll wrote them down, but we can ascribe some sort of meaning to them based on how they're appearing in their sentences. And so, hast thou slain the Jabberwock? So as we mentioned, nouns typically appear with determiners, and so we can intuit that Jabberwock is a noun because it's immediately preceded by a determiner the. What about beamish? My beamish boy. So this one, we can't. There's no. We did. It's not. None of the tests we did on the last slide would really work here. But something we know about adjectives is that they specify nouns, and so they can actually appear between that determiner and a noun, and so there's a determiner to the left and a noun to the right. What's in between is probably an adjective modifying that noun, and indeed that's what most speakers of English would arrive upon when looking at the word beamish. They would think, oh, that's an adjective that's describing the boy. What about frabjous? Well, you got a similar case, except you don't have the determiner. But typically, if there's no determiner, anything that precedes a noun will probably be modifying that noun and therefore be an adjective. So again, we arrive on frabjous being an adjective describing day. And then finally, we have chortled. So chortled typically verbs typically appear after nouns. That's something we can describe about English sentences. And so we have the noun he and the prepositional phrase in his joy after. So the sentence needs a verb, and so chortled is indeed the verb of the sentence. So even though we might not know exactly what these lexical words mean, we have clues based on basically context clues to determine the lexical category to which they belong. And through time, words can acquire meaning that's more and more known. And so chortled might be more of a meaningful verb than it was when Lewis Carroll wrote that, 100 years ago. But you could say this girl is chortling, I guess. This person's chortling. Who knows? But distributional context is often our biggest clue in English, because English does have kind of a set pattern with the order of how its words appear in the sentence. And many languages do. However, English is quite strict in the order in which words can appear in a sentence. And because of that, context and distribution within a certain context is going to be our biggest clue to categorization of lexical words. So now that we have categories, we can start to develop rules that utilize these categories into phrase structures. So put these words together into phrases, we have to structure them in a structured way. So we have our baseline categories of words, we can put them into these larger structures. So our blueprint in this course for phrase structure will be called XBar Rules. And it's because we see in the middle of this diagram here, we have something that's an X with a bar, or an apostrophe if you want, or a prime symbol. In linguistics, we call that X bar. And so that's going to be sitting in the middle of each of our phrases. And we can replace that X with any of our categories. So our phrase structure rules call for binary branching schemes, or schemata, or schema, or scheme, for structuring any phrase. So any phrase will be made up of binary branching at various levels. And so a phrase we'll call an XP. So P is phrase, X is a variable, which can be any of our categories. So you could have a verb phrase, a noun phrase, an adjective phrase, an adverb phrase, a prepositional phrase. So the various parts we'll define here of our XBar rules are in kind of decreasing order of obligatoriness, mandatoriness. I don't know what the word here is. But the head is going to be the most obligatory part of any phrase. And that's why it's called the head. It is going to be our main, the only part that's necessary for a phrase is the head. So every prepositional phrase has a preposition, every verb phrase has a verb, every noun phrase has a noun, every adverb phrase has an adverb, every adjective phrase has an adjective. And so each of those phrases has a head that it must have. And that's how we define the phrase. So we see here, it sits kind of in the middle, but down low, below the X bar level, at the X level. The head level, as we call it, the head node. So heads can be any lexical category: noun, verb, adjective, preposition, and adverb. So anytime one of those lexical categories appears as a head, it will change all of those X's into its lexical category. So that's something we'll call the endowment of their phrase with their category. So when you have a noun, you'll have a noun phrase. When you have a verb, you have a verb phrase. When you have an adjective, you have an adjective phrase. When you have a preposition, you have a prepositional phrase. And when you have an adverb, you have an adverb phrase. So a level above that is we're going to call the specifier. So this appears kind of on the top, or the second level of this XP, at the Y level to the left. And this is called specifier because it does various different roles depending on the head, but so we can't really outline a general specific function for the general specifier, but what they typically do is provide some sort of modification to the head. So they serve to clarify or narrow down the meaning of their head. And they're always at the edge of the phrases, and depending on the language, it will either be on the left edge of the phrase or the right edge. In English, it happens to be that specifiers are always on the left edge. So that's why this specifier, Y, is on the left edge of this tree diagram, left of the head and the complement. So specifiers can be a variety of categories. They're often function words, but they can be lexical. So they can be a determiner. So the determiner would go there, an adverb would go there when it's modifying a verb, and a degree word would go there when it's modifying an adjective, a preposition, or a noun. So we're starting to fill in, and I hope you're imagining changing these variables for actually specific heads or specific categories, and you could see how we could start to build a structure from here. The last level we will talk about are the complements. So these provide further information regarding what the head is doing within a sentence. So typically this will be to continue the rest of a sentence is what complements do, or to continue the rest of a clause. So complements are always going to be a phrase of their own. So this is how we get phrases within phrases within phrases within phrase, something we call recursion. That is at the heart of how we'll define our phrase structure. So that's why we have here to the right of the head, X, we have the complement as a Z phrase or Z phrase, ZP. And so this is going to be a phrase of their own with a different or separate head than either the head or the specifier. So noun phrases can be the complements of verbs. When a verb has an object, that the object will be made by a complement, which is a noun phrase. When a preposition has an object, its object will be the complement phrase of a noun phrase in the complement position. Prepositional phrases can also be complements to a noun or even other prepositional phrases. So you can imagine a series of prepositional phrases. So I am on the bench in the park across from the school next to the fire station. So all of that was just linking together prepositional phrases by putting a prepositional phrase within the complement of technically the noun phrase, the object, each of those objects. So you'd have a prepositional phrase with a complement of a noun phrase, and that noun phrase's complement would be a prepositional phrase. So again, you're seeing you're just embedding different phrases within phrases to get more specific meanings. And that's what complements are doing, providing that place to embed. So if we want to fill out this with a specific phrase instead of just having variables, we could try it out with the enemy of my enemy. So it's not a simple single phrase here. We see we have words of various categories. We have a determiner, we have a noun, we have a preposition, we have a determiner, we have a noun. So the enemy of my enemy, think about how that might look like with our phrase structure here, our XBar phrase structure. Don't think too long though, because I'll give it to you here. So we start with our head. And so the head of the enemy of my enemy is enemy. Which enemy? Well, that depends. So I think it'll be this first enemy, because if we wanted to make a verb from here, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we're talking about what this person's doing. So this will be what's going to participate in the rest of the sentence. And so that's probably going to be the subject. So that's going to be the head of this noun phrase. So we start here, we have enemy, and we build up first. And so we get the determiner to its left. And so that's something we know about determiners in English, is that, or specifiers in English, determiners and specifiers, is that they appear to the left of their head. And so we can attach this determiner to the left of this head noun enemy. And so we have to be binary branching though. So if we want to add a later complement, we have to have that intermediate level of the N bar or the X bar for generally all phrases. And that's what XBar is doing. That's why we call it the XBar. It provides the ability to do infinitely binary branching. And so this intermediate level is the N bar, and that will come together with the determiner to get the enemy in a noun phrase with enemy as the head. However, we can further give further information of who this enemy is by adding a complement. And so this complement would be the prepositional phrase of my enemy. And so what this triangle here means is that it has a further phrase structure on its own, but it can't fit it on the page. So I just put it in a triangle to say, hey, this isn't a simple preposition. It's actually a whole phrase that has its own structure that will end up being like a triangle. But I'll just give a simple triangle to fill that role as the complement phrase. And so that looks exactly like our XBar structure, except we filled it out with specific things, with the head being the noun, the specifier being the determiner, and the complement being the prepositional phrase. And so that's going to be all of syntax. We're done. Now we can move on to semantics, right? Well, it's not so simple, but this is the core of phrase structure and syntactic analysis based on these XBar rules. So I said there's more to it than that. It's not that simple. So here are some further notes. So you might notice that specifiers are always above the head level and the complements. And so they're appearing up and to the left in English. They could appear up and to the right in other languages. But so that's something to know, though, is that specifiers are always above heads and complements. Whereas heads and complements are always directly below that XBar level. So this intermediate level, as I said, provides you with that opportunity to go down to the head while also maintaining binary branching available and a branch available for that complement phrase afterwards. However, if any of these two is absent, we kind of can assume a structure. We always assume that this is the structure. So whenever, however, a specifier or complement is absent, we don't actually have to write this intermediate XBar level. We can just omit it with the assumption that our readers would know that there actually is an XBar level. It's just that it's kind of pointless to write an XBar if it's not actually binary branching into a complement phrase. Or if a phrase doesn't have a specifier, we don't need this XBar level. We could just bring this XP down as dominating the X and the ZP with the assumption that, yeah, if we wanted to be really specific, we could expand this and show that there's an empty specifier, which is just kind of redundant. So we just omit the XBar level, and that's something you could do when you're writing your trees. And so when the specifier is absent, you just have XP above an X and a ZP for the head and the complement. Like we have here, eat the spinach. We just have the verb phrase going down into the verb and its object, the noun phrase, the spinach. Or if there's indeed no complement, you can just have the verb phrase going down directly to the specifier and the head. And so the spinach would actually be a complementless noun phrase, the spinach. The is the specifier. Spinach, there's no complement, so we just have noun phrase branching into the determiner specifier, the, and noun head spinach. Some additional assumptions we have with an XBar regard names and pronouns. So these are specific types of nouns which are heads of noun phrases, but they always lack a specifier and a complement. They're already specific enough that they don't need these further informations of the specifier or the complement. So with that, you can just write a noun phrase above any name or pronoun, and it's assumed that the specifier position is empty as well as the complement position. So here, it's my old name, Brett, but here we have just a noun phrase going right into the noun Brett or Betsy. The same thing with the pronoun. The noun phrase goes right into a noun, doesn't need a specifier, doesn't need a complement, so it's just a straight line down to the noun they. Another note, possessives and possessive pronouns are types of specifiers for noun phrases. So these are noun phrases within a specifier position. So this is something we do in this course is we have possessives, or we have possessive pronouns. The dog's toy. So we're talking about a toy belongs to the dog. So the dog is acting as a specifier, the dog's toy of the toy. And so the specifier position of this noun phrase headed by toy is actually this noun phrase, this whole noun phrase, the dogs. So the specifier of toy is the dogs. And we could replace the dogs with a possessive pronoun. So similarly, pronouns, as we said, are noun phrases that lack a specifier and a complement. But our would be a pronoun that is being possessor, so it is our specifier, a specifier noun phrase for a noun, which is ahead of its own phrase. And so again, the blue is indicating it's a specifier, and the orange is the people. So our people is a noun phrase being specified by a noun phrase. So those are our assumptions of XBar. And again, most of that can be generalized to any sentence in language. But we mentioned how they're made up of many phrases kind of strung together or within each other, embedded within each other. So, as you may have guessed, trees for phrases may be made up of other phrases which have their own trees, which have their own phrases, which have their own trees, which have their own phrases, ad infinitum. So this is something we call recursion, and indeed can go on infinitely for as long as the sentence needs it to. So recursion is operationalized in our structure by an operation which we call merge. So merge, the book and I will define as an operation that combines elements to form a larger element within our XBar schema. So with merge, you can merge a determiner into a noun in order to get the noun phrase which has the determiner in the specifier position of that noun. So here we have the determiner, the, and the noun cat. We merge them together to get the noun phrase, the cat. And so here is the cat. In addition to this, I mean, you can merge basically any. This is how we get our phrases into larger phrases. You could merge a verb and a noun phrase together to get a verb phrase. So our verb will be our head of this phrase because it's not a phrase yet. And so we can have the verb pet and the noun phrase, which we just built with our merging of the and cat. So pet the cat is our noun phrase, which we want as our complement for the verb. So we merge them together to get the verb phrase, pet the cat. No specifier this time because the cat is our complement. Again, we're skipping that intermediate VBAR level. And so please pet the cat now. Thank you. And indeed, this is how you build those phrases into larger and larger and more recursive phrases that are uttered in any language that we want to analyze. However, languages do, as I mentioned or briefly hinted at earlier, languages do differ by the directionality of whether the specifiers are to the left of the head or to the right, and whether the complements are to the left of the head or to the right. So just be careful with that. In English, it's generally the case that specifiers are to the left and complements are to the right. Not always, though, but generally. Other languages can have different tendencies. So, as I mentioned, sentences. Sentences are going to be the end result of putting all of our phrases together to form our thoughts that we're expressing in language. And so it's the end result of all of our merge operations that we form from our tiniest little words, specifiers and heads, up to putting a noun phrase and a verb phrase together to form a sentence. So eventually the phrases will all merge into that complete sentence, which is our largest unit of syntactic analysis. Obviously, language is more than just individual sentences. When we put sentences together, we're actually developing context, and that's something we talk about in pragmatics. But at the individual sentence level, we're just dealing with syntax. So that's our largest unit, is the sentence. The largest unit of syntactic analysis is the sentence. So sentence structure is the same rules as phrases. However, we will be introducing something that just helps connect our noun phrases and our verb phrases, and that's the tense phrase. And so this is going to be the actual level that noun phrases and verb phrases come together in order to form a sentence. So that's something that sets apart a full sentence from just a verb phrase, is that sentences have tenses. In English especially, every sentence will have a tense, and that's why we call the sentence a tense phrase and call it TP for a tense phrase. And so just like any other phrase, it's made up of a specifier, a head, and a complement. And if we're calling it a tense phrase, that means we have a head that is a tense, and so we'll build around that tense head. But you're thinking, what exactly are the types of things that are tense heads? Well, they're not often pronounced in English. They're just, this is just a leap of faith you have to make within syntax. Some of them are pronounced, but usually they're not. And so for like a simple thing like I eat lettuce, or I eat salad, or I eat the spinach, you know that those are all present tense verbs, and that's because there is a T head there that is not past, so it's a minus past T head that is serving as connecting the subject I with the verb phrase eat the spinach. And that's providing the ability for those separate phrases to come together with a minus past or a present or present tense sense with that's kind of unpronounced. And so we'll indicate this through the use of features. Anytime there's something you really can't see in linguistics, you just indicate it with features, usually. And so you could have a plus past feature or a minus past feature, depending on the actual tense of the sentence. And that'll go as your T head that's unpronounced. This is also where auxiliary verbs appear. So if we had like I would eat the lettuce, or I would eat salad, the would actually be the auxiliary, which is going to be our T head. And that's why you can't say I would, because it actually takes the place where that, or I will would, where the unspoken tense is at. The auxiliary is kind of mutually exclusive with that. So anytime there's an auxiliary, you can't specify plus or minus past. Anytime that you specify plus or minus past, you can't have an auxiliary. So that's something key here, is that plus past and minus past are actually our unpronounced heads that are just providing a unpronounced feature to the sentence to provide it with a tense head that can connect that noun phrase and the verb phrase into a sentence. So to see this in action, we can start with our tense phrase. When we start with a tense phrase, our head has to be the T. And so if we want to build a sentence, we can put that as our head, and then we could build our specifier to the left and our verb phrase complement to the right. And so we could say the astronauts. I don't know where the sentence is going, actually. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So here, this is the whole complete sentence. We started with our T head. We built the specifier, which was a noun phrase to the left, the astronauts. So the subject of a sentence will be the specifier of a tense phrase, and the verb phrase of a sentence, everything after basically is the verb and everything after it will be the complement of that T head. And so we build that to our right and below, and then now we can actually merge them together into our tense phrase. So we have that intermediate T bar level, which connects the T head and the verb phrase complement, and we have the TP level, which connects the noun phrase specifier and the T bar node together into the tense phrase. So the astronaut boarded the rocket is a sentence that is plus past at its core, with the T head plus past. And that's how you build sentences. And if you want to change that T head into an auxiliary verb, you can. Typically, these T heads will still carry a feature, but you just happen to pronounce it with an actual word. So if we want to change boarded into will board, change that into a future tense with the will auxiliary, you could say the astronauts will board the rocket, your sentence would look exactly the same, except instead of a plus past invisible T head, you have a minus past will, which is visible and is pronounced as an auxiliary verb, as the head of the tense phrase. The astronauts will board the rocket. But otherwise, these sentences are exactly the same in their structure. So that does it for sentence, how we can build sentences within our XBar schema. But we still need to determine which phrases are allowed and what can actually serve as a whole specifier, and what can serve as a whole complement, or what can serve as a whole head. So how can we be sure of what we've grouped into each of those levels? And how can we know that the grouping is valid within our XBar schema? Well, that's where these tests for phrase structure come in. And so there are various tests for phrase structure, which we'll examine on the following few slides. These are substitution, movement, and coordination. So we had tests for determining the actual lexical category of various heads. Now we can test for whether or not those groups of heads can actually come together as a valid XBar constituent. And so they have certain behaviors that they can or can't do, depending on if they are or aren't a valid XBar constituent. And that's what these tests do. So the first of these tests is substitution. And so this substitution test states that if you can replace an element with a smaller word or phrase, smaller element B, so replace element A with a smaller element B, and it retains grammaticality, then element A is a constituent of the category indicated by the word phrase B. So if you can really start to just simplify things into individual things, individual words that you know their lexical category, then you can make assumptions about the constituency of each of those, that element A and element B are of the same constituent, and they can behave as similarly within the grammar and maintain that grammaticality. So the substitution test is you basically replace a large element with a smaller element, a word. And you could do this with various categories by asking with key elements. And so for noun phrases, the test elements you could use as substitutes are pronouns. So if you could substitute a phrase that you're wondering about its category and its constituency, if you could replace it with a pronoun like they, she, her, it, them, her, him, one is also something that can act as a single word replacement for a larger noun phrase, then you have a noun phrase, and it can do what noun phrases do in the sentence. So the big black book falls off the table. If we can replace the big black book with a pronoun, then what we have is a noun phrase. So it falls off the table. Yes, the big black book does appear to be a noun phrase. So this passes the substitution test. We could also do it in other positions. So the girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door. Can we replace the big burly man standing by the door with a pronoun? Yeah. So the girl ran past him, and it maintains grammaticality. You maybe lose specificity of meaning, and that's why we have these options. If you want to be more specific, you use the whole noun phrase. But what it is a noun phrase. So this also passes the substitution test. If you were to cut that up into a different set, so if we say the girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door, and we were wondering if the big burly man standing was a noun phrase, could we say the girl ran past him by the door? Kind of. It's really a different meaning at that point. I just picked that spot at random, but that's really an ambiguous one. The girl ran past, if we want to say the big burly man standing by and test that, can we replace the big burly man standing by? The girl ran past him the door. No. Then you get into ungrammaticality and failing of the substitution test. So the big burly man standing by is not a noun phrase in that sense. You could do the same with the prepositional phrases. So the key elements that you can insert for the substitution are there, here, and yonder, and these are something we call positional pronouns, and they can serve as the elements to test for constituency as a prepositional phrase. So the big black book falls off the table. If we want to test off the table for constituency as a preposition, can replace it with there. The big black book falls there. Here, a big black book falls here. Yeah, you can. So it passes the substitution test for prepositional phrase constituency. What about the girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door? We want to replace by the door with something. We can. The girl ran past the big burly man standing there. And so if you could replace it with here, there, yonder, then you have a prepositional phrase. Similarly, with verb phrases, you can test for constituency by replacing what you're testing with do or do so. And these are something we'll call dummy verbs. So the dummy verb substitution is the test for verb phrases. So the big black book falls off the table. Can you replace falls off the table with do? The big or do so, or an inflected form of do, like does or did, or does or did so. The big black book does so. Yeah, you can do that. That makes sense. It does. You're not really saying anything, because does so it's meaningless, kind of. It's just saying this is a verb, and that's all we're looking for, is whether or not it's a verb phrase. And so the big black book falls off the table. The big black book does so. It's grammatical, so it passes the substitution test. We do it for our second sentence. The girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door. You replace ran past the big burly man standing by the door with did so. Yes, the girl did so. And it passes the substitution test for a verb phrase. So again, I kind of hinted at this earlier. If the answers to any of these questions, whether you can replace them with this, is not so clear, then it probably doesn't pass the substitution test. So if we look at the big black book falls off the table and try to replace the big with it black book falls off the table, that is not grammatical. So the big is not a noun phrase. It can't be replaced with a pronoun. Ran past the, if we try to replace that with did so and try to test that for a verb phrase, because we do have a verb, ran past the girl did so, big burly man standing by the door. No, not really. So ran past the is not a constituent. It's made up of parts of separate constituents in that case. So this doesn't pass the verb phrase constituency test of the dummy verb do. So we've seen how phrases pass or don't pass the substitution test. That'll be one of our primary evidence for phrase structure. Another test for phrase structure is the movement test. So constituents words that come together and form a constituent can be moved together as a single unit to another part of the sentence and retain grammaticality. So if you can move them and the sentence still works, then what you've moved make up an actual constituency within the phrase structure. And so we call this the movement test, where you move the element that you're asking, usually to the beginning or the end of the sentence. So if we could try to move the book fell off the table, we try to move off the table to the beginning. Off the table the book fell. It's kind of stilted, but it works. Off the table, you get what I'm trying to say when off the table the book fell. It's just kind of moving off the table around, and it does so grammatically. So off the table is a constituent. In this case, it's a prepositional phrase. The girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door. We try to move the big burly man standing by the door to the beginning. The big burly man standing by the door, the girl ran past. Well, that's worse, really, if we're being honest. So, but it's not. We're questioning it. We don't know for sure. It doesn't pass, but it doesn't really fail. So we just have to try other tests. And indeed, if you try to test that with a pronoun test, the substitution test, it passes. So then we do know the big burly man standing by the door is a noun phrase, because you replace it with a pronoun. So it's often good to run as many tests as possible. And if you get a positive result in one of them, then you're probably good to go. But if you get an inconclusive result, it doesn't mean you're inconclusive. It just means you should try to run another test. So that's why we have multiple types of tests. Speaking of multiple types of tests, we have our last test, the coordination. So this is a bit more difficult to carry out, but it is indeed something that phrases can do, is they can be coordinated. So two separate constituents of the same category can be coordinated by a conjunction. That's what conjunctions are doing. They're coordinating two constituents of the same category. So in order to, and this is typically done with the word and. So you can add a conjunction plus something, plus a constituent that you know is a constituent, you know its category, then this serves as a valid test for whether the element you're questioning is the constituent of the type that you are inserting with and. So if the grammaticality is retained, it is a constituent of that category, and if it's not, then it is not a constituent of the same category, and you should run some other tests as well to determine what other type of constituent it could be. So you might have to try coordinating with several different categories in order to nail down its specific constituent, because a verb phrase cannot coordinate with a noun phrase, even if they both are valid constituents, because coordination is actually putting two things of the same category together. So the big black book falls off the table. If we want to test that, we can coordinate that with a simple noun phrase, the paper. The big black book and the paper fall off the table. We change for agreement because coordination changes the agreement if you have multiple things. So the big black book and the paper fall off the table is a valid sentence. So the big black book is of the same category as the paper, and we know the paper is a noun phrase, so the big black book is a noun phrase as well. It passes the coordination test. The girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door. So if we want to test whether by the door is a particular type of phrase, we can coordinate. So the girl ran past the big burly man standing by the door and below the window. That works. But we know that below if we happen to know that below the window is a prepositional phrase, then by the door has to be a prepositional phrase as well because it passed the coordination test. So what's good to know is that if an element passes any one of these tests, it is a constituent that can occupy a node in our trees. So it doesn't have to pass all of them, it just has to pass one, and that's enough evidence to say, yes, it is a constituent in our phrase structure, and it can behave as that constituent. So that's where we'll end it today. We'll start to get a bit more complicated next week with different types of sentences, and that will require an additional operation, which we'll define as move. So that's what the readings for the next week, which will not be for another 2 weeks because we do have a break in our term, our reading break, next week. So the readings for the week after next will be sections 2 through 4 of Chapter 5 in Contemporary Linguistic Analysis. But before we get to reading week, know that there are a couple deadlines this week. We have discussion post forum 4, which has to do with morphology and syntax. That'll be due on Thursday, and the assignment, which has to do with phonetics, phonology, and morphology, is due on Friday, assignment 1 via D2L if you're doing those. But that's it for today. Thank you all for listening. Have a great week this week and a wonderful reading week next. And you'll hear me next time. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and you'll hear me then. Thanks.